Thanks, folks, and thanks for bearing with us with the technical issues. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I have a tendency to move around, so sorry if it sounds like I'm like on a travelling train at various points. Okay, so this is a talk, on OKRs, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I am a product consultant. I've used OKRs and set up OKRs in startups as well as really large enterprises. So, and what I found is that there's a common set of patterns and practices that actually work across those different levels of complexity.
Sorry, can you tell us what an OKR is?
Oh, sure. Actually, does somebody in the audience want to kind of shout out what an OKR is? Yep, objectives and key results. And they're very much a buzzword at the moment and very much in. They're like the sexy goal-setting methodology, you know, for now. As you can tell, because I've never spoken at Agile on the beach, given a product talk, and had this incredible turn up. So obviously OKRs are very much in vogue at the moment. So it's what a lot of organizations used to previously call goals, you know, MBOs, management by objectives, etc. But OKRs are the current methodology that are actually quite popular. So we'll talk a little bit about why there's so much hype, why there's so much pain around their adoption, and some very specific practical things that you can do in your organisations to try to actually address some of the key challenges you're probably facing. But just as a show of hands, so I'm aware of who's in the audience, how many of you work in a product or delivery team? So, you know, you build a product or a service that consumers or business users use. Okay, that's most of you. Is there anybody who is in another kind of technical or operational type role? Like whether it's around operability of your services, etc.? No? A couple? Okay, yep. I like the fact that a lot of you actually raised your hands when I was talking about product teams as well. So you see yourselves as being part of that. Excellent. And is there anybody here who's from, let's call it business operations? So you could be here from finance, HR, you know, all of the non-producty sort of teams in a business. Fantastic. Okay, a couple of you. Excellent. What I'll do then is I'll primarily talk about OKRs from a product delivery perspective, but I will throw in some examples from the rest of the business as well, so you can see how it applies to you as well. All right, so first of all, there's loads of hype around OKRs. We know that Google use OKRs, we know that Netflix, Deliveroo, all the big tech players use OKRs, and we've read blogs, watched videos perhaps, you know, on YouTube about how they're so great at creating alignment and focus in organizations, and also giving autonomy to teams to actually figure out what are the experiments and the tests that they want to run to help move the business forward. So there's a lot of stuff around the alignment, the focus, the autonomy, which is obviously where we want to go in our organisations. But at the same time, what I found is across organisations, across industries, this is what I've heard. This is what my colleagues kind of oftentimes hear. That from the teams on the ground who are doing the work, we hear things like, we don't do the important stuff because we won't do anything that is not in our OKRs. So we're so focused on making sure OKRs capture all of our work, anything that's not in the OKRs, like doing maintenance work, maybe doing some big bets or some fixes that have, you know, been sitting around in the backlog for a long time, they never get looked at. I can see some people nodding, so that's something that seems to resonate for some of you. Another common thing I've heard from teams is that we never achieve our OKRs, like they're too ambitious, you know, with all of the different things that we have going on. So that's quite a demoralizing thing. And in turn, one of my colleagues, one of my clients actually said that I actually get performance anxiety. Because there's a secondary aspect to this, which is that in a lot of organizations, whether or not you achieve your OKRs determines whether or not you're going to get a pay rise or a bonus pay. Again, I'm seeing a couple of people kind of nod, so that it is actually quite a common practice. Then the third kind of common thing I've heard from teams is that we can't figure out the right metrics and then how to even measure these, like, you know, the changes that we want to make. So measurability is a big challenge. You know, there are some things that you're trying to do around loyalty of a customer. How do you measure that? Because customer satisfaction is such a lagging indicator, you know. It takes so long before you start to see satisfaction increase. How do you know that the change that you're making right now is resulting in satisfaction increase for our customers? That can actually be quite hard. So just as a show of hands, does one or do any of these insights here resonate for you in terms of your personal experiences? That's well over 50% of the group here. Okay, great. So, ultimately, I believe that one of the core reasons... Oh no! Oh, there we go. I feel like, so to be honest, like OKRs are not a very sexy topic, but the showing and unshowing of this is probably going to be the most exciting thing that's going to happen on social. Okay, so good OKRs emerge when the company culture is already focused on having focus, like radical focus, like only doing a couple of things at a strategic level, having alignment across your teams, trying to create impact and transparency across the whole organization, and having lots of employee engagement. This is a really key point, because when people look at companies like Google and Netflix, they say, great, they've got focus, they've got engagement, they've got transparency, they're using OKRs. Let's use OKRs and we'll get transparency and alignment and engagement, and that's not how it works. Those cultures are already focused on these things, which is why OKRs work in their context. You cannot change your culture just by using OKRs as a methodology. So that's the very first point. Your company already needs to be focused on these things, and these conversations need to happen at the exec level all the way through to the teams actually doing the work and creating the value in the organization. So I believe that we absolutely can be successful, and I've seen this in a number of organizations, if we do two kind of things. One thing is we focus on shaping a culture of these things. So what are the other things that we're doing to create transparency? Do we publish who got bonuses, who didn't get bonuses? What the average pay rise is in an organization? That's a sign of transparency. And in parallel, we have a common understanding of what good OKRs mean. So what do good objectives and key results actually mean for an organization? And that's primarily what my talk's going to be on. It's about how can we have a common understanding, because a lot of the pain that we get is in part because we don't already have this culture. But that's hard to influence, right? I could give you we could do a workshop that runs for a whole week and just talk about culture. What we're going to do instead is talk about some very practical things that we can do around having a common definition to make sure that you can actually put some of these things into practice. Okay, so in creating a common understanding, there are loads of different schools of thought, and I'm basically drawing on a lot of the thinking from two thought leaders, Christina Wadke and Felipe Castro. As a show of hands, has anybody heard of either of those two? Okay, a couple of you. They're actually, they've been around in the OKRs thinking space for some time, but they actually deviate quite a bit from where Google started with OKRs. Google was one of the earlier companies to adopt OKRs and build a lot of the hype around it. But there's a lot of really good thinking that I believe Felipe and Christina have around OKRs, which actually make it a lot more, I think, practical for companies that aren't Google. So first of all, OKRs are a goal-setting experimentation methodology and not a work or performance management methodology. So this is where most organizations, again, fall down. The key here in the first part is that lots of organizations use OKRs for setting goals. But it's not just about setting goals. In their design, and I'll show you how, they're actually meant to encourage experimentation. Because what you do is you first start with an objective. You say, how do we measure whether we're going to achieve this objective? And then you come up with your ideas, your solutions to achieve that. So you're already forming a hypothesis. You're saying, I believe we'll be able to increase revenue over this particular quarter or this 6 months if we do X, Y, Z. So you're constantly trying to see, by doing X, Y, Z, are we moving revenue? So it is actually an experimentation methodology, that sets goals. And the second part, and again, this is where a lot of organizations fall down, is that OKRs are not for tracking work and they're not for tracking performance. If you use OKRs to track work, we end up in that situation where you don't do work that's not in your OKRs. And if you try to use OKRs to capture all of your work, you end up with 50 OKRs. And that's the struggle that a lot of teams have. They're like, how do we balance these priorities? Because we've got 10 OKRs we're trying to achieve this quarter. It's too much work. So it's not a work management tool or methodology. And in terms of performance management, if you try to imagine with OKRs, what you're trying to do is you're trying to be very ambitious with the objectives you're setting as an organization and as a team. If you're trying to be ambitious, but at the same time you're saying, I will reward you if you achieve that particular target or that key result, you're actually providing an incentive to not be very ambitious, right? Because you're not going to get a bonus. You're not going to get a promotion if you don't achieve the key result. So a key thing is to actually try to decouple your performance management from OKRs, and that means that you can properly use OKRs for experimentation and for really pushing the organization forward. And that's very controversial, by the way. A lot of organizations very much struggle with that because they fail to see the difference between trying to move an organization forward versus reward their employees. but there are very good ways to do it, and if we have time in the Q&A, we might talk through some of those examples. Okay, so we've spoken about having a common definition. This is a common definition, and hopefully this has been able to bust a couple of myths that are out there around OKRs. So to come back to, I think, your earlier question about what are OKRs, OKRs basically answer three questions. Where do I want to go as a business or as a team? How do I know I'm getting there? And what do I think are the next steps? Not what are all of the steps, just the next steps, because this is very much an incremental goal-setting methodology. So the objective tells us where do I want to go. The key results tell me how do I know I'm getting there. And the experiments or the initiatives or projects, use whatever terminology you want, they tell us what we think the next steps are going to be. So this is an example. I won't spend too much time on this because there's a lot of words here, but if you take a photo, you're more than welcome to kind of talk to me about it afterwards. This is an example from an ex-client. I can see some people in the audience smiling. So the objective here was to make our customers an offer they can't refuse. This is a sandwich selling company, let's say. So they had a couple of key results for a given quarter. So these are how do we know that we're making our customers an offer they can't refuse? What are the signals that are going to tell us that? Well, the first key result is by increasing monthly renewing subscribers for our coffee subscription service in 2 countries, in the UK and in France, by these percentages. And the experiments, the way that we think we're going to get there, so this is where the experimentation comes in, right? We believe if we did better acquisition targeting, so if, let's say on Facebook, we actually targeted our potential subscribers better, or our existing subscribers better, we'd actually be able to see the result in our monthly renewing subscribers. It might be to nudge people, like the first people, as soon as people sort of subscribe, nudge them to actually drink their first coffee. Because once you've drunk your first coffee, you're like, I get why the subscription is great. So really nudge them through app notifications, for example. So these are all assumptions we're making, right? These are experiments. We think that that will result in that, but we won't know until we do it, and then we start to measure whether we were right. Now, interestingly, there was a really good article in Harvard Business Review that came out a couple of years ago that spoke about experimentation, and something like even in high experimentation-based cultures like your Booking.com, Spotify, etc., Google as well, less than 10% of experiments succeed. Now, if those companies that have those strong feedback loops are succeeding in less than 10% of their experiments, where are the rest of us? What is our success rate? So that's why it becomes really important to make sure that we are measuring, we have key results for the ideas that we have, and we're constantly on a daily, weekly basis seeing if we're moving those needles. Another thing that I would just want to point out over here, so we've got CRC and CSAT. So it's great that we're saying that we want to increase the renewing coffee subscribers. That's the positive change we want to see. But we might have some adverse effects. So by trying to encourage people to renew, we might be really pissing off our customers because we keep sending notifications. So their satisfaction ratings might go down. So in orange, we've got what we call the health metrics. So every key result should have health metrics. So you know that when we're pushing the right change, we're not creating adverse effects. So they kind of help balance and keep a holistic view of things. Out of curiosity, how many teams have how many folks here have heard of or have used health metrics in the past? Yep, great. And we use them a lot in terms of managing the service health, right, or product health. So it's really about using it now in a goal-setting capacity. Okay, so when it comes to actually setting OKRs, this is also where another area where a lot of teams can sometimes struggle. I believe the process is actually quite straightforward. So it's a simple process, but it's difficult to do. Step 1 is figure out how much capacity do you have for OKRs, because like we said, OKRs don't capture all our work. The second step is to set a company-level OKR, because we want to make sure that we're moving together as an organization. All the teams are moving in the same direction. So let's set the company OKR, so the most important strategic outcome is clear. Then we set the team OKRs, and a team can be defined in many different ways. You could have your cross-functional product teams. You might also have functional business teams like finance and HR. And then that means that all the teams know exactly what impact they'll have and how that's impacting the company OKR. And then lastly, but also most importantly, we're then experimenting, we're learning, and we're adapting. So we can't just set them and then wait to the end of the quarter or the year. We have to look at our results, our key results, on a daily, weekly basis to make sure that the bets that we're making in the experiments are correct. And then that way, we'll make sure that we're finding the cheapest and most effective way to actually have an impact. And that's why the Googles and the Netflixes of the world, OKRs work really well in their environment because they're already doing this. They're already experimenting on a daily basis. Okay, so let's talk about step one, which is OKRs capacity. I might pick up the pace a little bit just because we lost a bit of time earlier on. And I want to make sure that there's time for Q&A. So for OKRs capacity, this is a typical, I guess, model of what you have in most organizations where you've got vision, mission, strategy, company objective, and your company KRs. Then at the team level, you've got team OKRs, initiatives or experiments that achieve those OKRs, those KRs in particular, and then in parallel, you've got maintenance work and optimization work. Now I'm calling it maintenance and optimization. You can use whatever language you want as long as it's a consistent vocabulary you're using in your organization. But this is all of the other work, the non-OKR work, right? Production issues, tech debt, all of those incredibly important things that still need to happen. They have to sit alongside, not in, the OKRs. So let's measure our capacity. So this is a template that I've used with a couple of teams. Again, feel free to take a photo and use this with your teams. But the idea is to figure out, well, what are the working hours per week? Take away the admin time that we spend, like, check-ins, one-to-ones. How many workable hours does that give? And then you split the time to go, great, how much of that should be spent on, is currently spent on maintenance versus optimization versus OKRs work? So I think it helps to start with measuring what you're currently doing, and then you figure out where we need to go. So with maintenance work, my definition is that this is paying debt, architectural work, monitoring, analytics, product debt, any kind of debt, business debt. It includes any dependencies around that debt, BAU and support work. So this is, a lot of this is unplanned, right? You have to be reactive and responsive. And the idea is if we do this on a regular basis, we decrease how much maintenance work we need to do as a portion of our work. Then we've got our optimization. Now this is not huge, big strategic shifts. That comes from the OKRs. This is like little optimizations that you might be able to do. So for example, I was working with a team. We had a marketplace where we were advertising houses for sale. One of our optimization bits of work was to look at why people would look at properties and then not come back and look at the properties. They wouldn't save them. They wouldn't contact the agents. And so we realized that there were various things around the design of the page, the numbers for the real estate agents wasn't very clear. So these are really small changes, right? They're never going to make it into an OKR. And these are the sorts of changes that the team should have total autonomy to come up with. These are the ideas that you have in the little experiments that would take you a couple of days, a couple of weeks to do, so it doesn't make sense to put that through an OKRs process. And then you've got your OKRs work. So this is where changes are a little bit more strategic. So imagine you had like a tech debt problem and it got so big it's impacting the whole organization, right? Or a number of product teams. And you realize that actually if we don't pay off this debt, we're going to grind to a halt in 6 months. It might make sense that rather than all the teams do it through maintenance work, you now set a company OKR around that. Maybe, because it's a strategic priority. And if it's not that big a problem, we should continue doing that through maintenance work. So the other stuff that we would do through OKRs really is stuff that you could imagine you would ideally have an interest in a strategic way. So are you trying to launch a new product? Are you trying to move into a new market? Are there some significant changes you want to make to your product that's going to mean that you change your competitive position in the market as well? So that's kind of like roughly where kind of OKRs go. Right, so here are some non-product and delivery examples, because oftentimes I hear from teams in finance and other business teams but that's all fine for product teams, but what about us? We don't necessarily work on changes that impact the company bottom line. We're here to support the business. Actually, I believe that your work can also be categorized into maintenance, optimization, and OKRs-based work. So in HR, the maintenance stuff that you do all the time, you might have debt, like you might have you might have attrition in your company because maybe there's a poor accountability culture. Leadership teams aren't held to account, so people leave the company. That is cultural debt. Maybe you need to pay that cultural debt off. In terms of BAU, you're constantly inducting and onboarding new employees. BAU? Business as usual. Yeah, so these are like the ongoing things that you do, So with HR, it's inducting new employees. With marketing, it might be things like running seasonal campaigns, doing blogs, those sorts of things. Optimization work, same sort of thing, and OKRs as well. So OKRs might be, let's replace the recruitment system. That's a big project. We have to go through procurement. We need to upskill the whole organization, all line managers, etc. So that's a big thing, right? So something that I just want to call out here is, not all OKRs are going to necessarily come from your company OKR. So if you set a company OKR, some of these OKRs will absolutely come from there, and some of them will come bottom up. So the team comes up with it, because when you think about their OKR capacity, they've got lots of capacity, right? So if you have a company setting an OKR around, let's say, moving into a new market, HR might say, well, we've got nothing to do. You know, we have no OKRs that are going to help nudge that, or to help that. So instead, we're going to set our OKRs around the recruitment system, because we've got that capacity. So that's where the capacity makes sure that you still have time to do other work, but you're still in control, somewhat in control of your destiny. Okay, so that leads us on to company OKRs. Now, it's another good practice to set OKRs at two levels. One is at the company level, the other one is at the team level. Another anti-pattern is you see what's called cascading OKRs, where they're set at every single level of the organization, and it comes down to an individual. The reason that doesn't work is it means that it starts to dilute, and people start to have really conflicting and many OKRs. So you stop seeing, well, how do I manage the relative priorities of these things? So the idea is we set a company objective with KRs, ideally one company objective, typically for 6 months or a year. And that's the thing that's also very controversial, but again, more and more companies are learning to do this and actually see a lot of success by doing that. And then secondarily, the teams then set their OKRs. The teams who can impact the company objective base theirs on the company objective. The teams who have a lot of OKR capacity left because they can't really impact that objective, they set their own OKRs. That's totally fine. So a way to think about it is, if you imagine that you're in a car and you're going down a road and you've probably got your route mapped out in Google Maps, right? So that route that you've got mapped out in Google Maps, that's your company strategy. That's kind of telling you, like, where are you like, what's the path to get to where you want to get to, right? And your destination, the end point, that's your, you could call it your company vision. That's where you're going to get in 3 years' time, right? So you've got your path where you're going to get to in 3 years' time. So your company vision is where you're going to get to in 3 years' time. Your path is your business strategy. The next one step you take on that path, right? So as a car, I might need to go forward for a kilometre and then take a left. That next step that I take, that is your company OKR. It's literally the next step you take in your company strategy. And that's it. So it's actually quite simple. The reason it gets hard to do is because leadership teams worry that if that's all they set, nothing else will be done. So a part of this is about educating and getting leadership teams to trust their teams to do the rest of the work, to do the maintenance work, to do the optimization work. And to remember, because they have an OKR's capacity, they can still do really important strategic work. That's just not the most important thing, but it's still important. So once you've kind of set your company level OKR, the next thing is the teams need to look at it and go, great, which of us can actually influence that company objective and the company KRs? So this is where, if you remember that kind of big diagram where we had the vision at the top, then the strategy, then the company OKR and the team OKRs, you know, that's where the team OKRs start to come in. This is where it gets interesting, actually. So your company OKR will tend to either focus on something of value to the customer. So that, for example, it could be about moving into a new market, building a new product, that kind of thing, you know, or customer acquisition numbers, those sorts of things. If it's revenue, that's a little bit problematic because it's very hard for teams to know how they're going to impact revenue. So that's actually not generally a good practice. But customer metrics, like around acquisition, retention, loyalty, those sorts of things, are great metrics or great KRs. So you've got company OKRs that might focus on that, on the customer side. You've got company OKRs that might focus internally. So one of the clients that I was working with during COVID, they were actually in dire straits. So trying to build new business models and things like that was not where they were at. They wanted to keep their ship afloat. So that was their company objective, keep the ship afloat. It was about internally focused change. It was about getting more efficient, making sure that their relationships with partners, were the right ones that were working for them, etc. So that was more internally focused. And then the third type is if you're looking at your investors. So again, another client that I've worked with, they were planning on IPOing in 2 years' time. So actually their company objective for 2 years was really around the investor side and about market perception. So it was about, can we make sure we're at the right trade shows, we're showcasing our product, etc., etc. So your company OKR tends to be either focused on the customer, internally, or on investors. And then you look at your team OKRs. So how can you influence those things? So typically, and I'll talk about the example where, let's say, your company OKR is focused on customers. So if you imagine like you've got your customer, right? I'm just going to fake draw on this whiteboard. Imagine you've got your customer here, right? The people who are closest to the customer in your company are, actually, yeah, out of the audience, which are the teams who are closest to the customer? Like? Customer services, absolutely. They have a really intimate understanding. Anybody else?
User researchers.
Pardon?
User researchers.
User researchers, yep, absolutely. So the teams that are kind of providing services, you could say, directly to our customers, usually customer services, sales, marketing, our actual product, you could say, is providing direct value to our customer as well. So these teams, which includes user researchers, they tend to have the closest relationship with the customer and create direct value for our customers, right? So usually they're the first team to set up their team OKRs off the back of the company OKRs, because they can impact those directly and to the greatest degree. Then the next level out are the teams who support those teams. So you might have security, you might have ops, you might have other teams who still sit in the organization, but what they do is they support the teams who support the customer, who work directly with the customer. Does that make sense? Yeah? So you can see that once the customer-facing teams have set their OKRs, then the supporting teams can say, okay, well, can I support you in the work that you're doing with your OKRs? So that's where we start to get shared OKRs. So for example, with one of my customers, they were trying to set up a new ticketing system for customers to use when they had issues. So that was primarily focused on customer support, or customer success as they were called. So legal got involved, procurement got involved, a bunch of other people had to get involved from the support side in order to enable that product to be set up so that the customers could use that to set up their issues. So that's where legal, procurement, and customer support and the IT team actually had a shared OKR. And that's how they were able to stay focused on achieving that without sort of diverging. Then the next level out in an organization is typically what you would call the business services team. So they're focused not so much on the customer, but they're actually focused on running the business. So finance, they do accounting, right? Legal oftentimes sit there as well. You've got HR. So those teams typically don't often impact those customer-focused OKRs. So they tend to have more capacity for setting their own OKRs. And then lastly, you've got your governance layer. So you might have portfolio, you might have the board, etc. So generally there aren't OKRs set at that level. So if we focus on the customer and the teams closest to them, and then we iteratively work further out, what we start to do is every team has their OKRs capacity and it starts to reduce and reduce and reduce, and then whatever is left is what they use to set their own OKRs. Does that make sense? And what I found is when teams do that, it first of all reduces a lot of the confusion because you haven't got teams trying to set OKRs in any which direction. It also makes sure that you've got as many teams as possible focused on achieving that single company objective. So, I guess the next takeaway is really that shared OKRs create greater alignment, impact, and focus, which is actually the purpose of OKRs. And the reason why I just want to mention that is because a lot of people, again, believe that shared OKRs are not a good thing. A lot of people think that shared OKRs mean that I can't tell whether this team is having the impact on the key result or that team is having the impact. And that, to me, starts to smell a little bit like, not entirely, but a little bit like work management. Are the different teams doing their work and therefore are they having like can we track, like, what the work is that people are doing and what kind of impact that's having. Now, it is true that having shared OKRs means that measuring the impact that each team has had on the KR does get more tricky, but those problems have also been solved. There's a lot of A/B testing tools out there. There are plenty of customer success platforms out there that measure success and various other metrics at touch points or opportunities where you're kind of interacting with your customers. So there are ways to actually figure out whether or not you're having the impact that you think you're having. But because it's a hard problem to solve, oftentimes organizations shift away from that and they try to set their own, oftentimes conflicting OKRs. Right, so then the last step, once we've figured out our capacity, we've set the company level OKR, then we've set the team level OKRs. The third thing, as I mentioned, is actually the hardest and the most important, which is to experiment, to adapt, to learn, and to continue to update our results, and in some cases our OKRs. So sometimes I think it helps, and if you come to, Marcel and I are giving a talk tomorrow, so we'll talk a little bit about this as well. Like in businesses, we tend to have multiple cycles, right? Feedback cycles of work. So you've got the daily cycles, where you've got stand up and you do your work and you might have, catch up at the end of the day. Then you've got weekly or fortnightly cycles, which might be your sprint, where you've got your retrospective as well. Then you've got monthly cadences, then you've got, maybe 6 monthly and then yearly cadences. So I think it helps to think about these different cadences or these different cycles and how OKRs fit into that. Because so we've got maintenance work, initiative, we've got OKRs, and we've got optimization work. And each of those little cadences has to tackle all three of those types of work, right? And typically what we find is that OKRs tend to be spoken about on a fortnightly, maybe monthly basis, but nothing is done on a daily basis. So when you've got your 3 different buckets of work, as a team, I find it's quite useful to go, well, what are our cadences as a team and as an organization? And what are the things that we're going to do to set, to track progress, and then to celebrate the 3 different types of work we're doing. Because again, another thing that I've seen is that at a company town hall, the leadership team might talk about how we've done really well with our OKRs, but they won't mention anything about maintenance, and they won't mention anything about optimization. And what that does is it sends a message that OKRs are really important and nothing else is. And that's the bias that we need to challenge, right? So this is also partly an education piece for leadership teams, for us to really sell the value. And to be honest, in my experience, senior execs, they understand this. They understand you need to keep the lights running. It's kind of generally, not always, but generally in the sort of middle management layer where things start to get a little bit hazy. So this is an education piece to make sure that on our daily, weekly, quarterly, yearly cycles, we're celebrating those 3 types of work and we're talking about those 3 types of work. Because the other thing is, it's actually it can be quite insightful for leadership teams if they know that, let's say, 60% of these teams' capacity is spent on maintenance work, 20% on OKRs, and then 20% on optimization work. That, to me, is a warning sign that actually we need to solve the maintenance problem so that we can free up more capacity for OKRs work. Because that's the goal at the end of the day, have more capacity for doing strategic work. So this can be really insightful for actually having leadership teams update their strategy. So, we've spoken about, like, I guess, a couple of the myths, a couple of the practices, etc., around how you can sort of address the challenges with OKRs. So a question, and unfortunately you can't see this right now, but a couple of questions to ask yourselves, for those of you who are using OKRs, is, are we set up for success? And there are a couple of questions that I think it's kind of worth asking. So the first thing is, can we actually set good OKRs because we have a consistent definition, and everybody's aligned on that definition? Do we know our capacity? So are we measuring our current capacity, like how much time we're actually spending on OKRs and how much time we think we should be spending? So if we're spending 20%, can we measure that and know that with certainty? And can we measure over time how that increases to, like, let's say 30 or 40%? Steve at the You Build It, You Run It talk earlier today spoke about technical debt and how you could measure that in Jira. And I've seen lots of business teams also use tools like Trello and Asana for doing the same thing across the board. The third question is, can we do all our work? Do we have permission to not just do OKRs, but also have capacity for maintenance and optimization work? And can we keep leadership teams away from that because they trust us to set those priorities? because that is where the team should have total autonomy. Yes, they can be stress tested and there should be guardrails, but teams should really be coming up with those priorities with maintenance and optimization work. That's why we hire really clever people. Fourthly, can we experiment well? Do we use OKRs in the way that I've just kind of been speaking about? Because it is quite hard. It's hard to give a number and then talk about what are the different initiatives that could potentially impact that number. So, you know, revenue is a classic example. It's very hard to know what are the things that are going to impact revenue. But, you know, let's say we're talking about customer acquisition. That's also like a very hard thing sometimes to measure. So, you know, do we have the muscle to be able to kind of come up with these bets and actually measure whether or not we're correct? Almost lastly, do we get rewarded for doing the right thing? So if we are, let's say, coming up with some ideas, we're not seeing a movement in our key results, do we get punished for that? Or do we actually get support from leadership teams to say, okay, so maybe that bet wasn't quite right. Why? Are we looking at the data? Are we trying to understand maybe we should be pivoting on this or trying something a little bit different? Or working with marketing, because actually they're running campaigns which might be muddying our data and muddying our efforts. So the approach or the response that leadership team have to failure and have to no movement in the KRs or a negative movement in the KRs is really key to this as well. Okay, and if we do that, I genuinely believe, and I've certainly seen this firsthand, that you can have a huge change. So like, you know how earlier on we were talking about teams struggling because there's no capacity to do non-OKR work, teams feeling performance anxiety, and folks can't figure out the right metrics. All of these problems can be solved if we have the consistent definition and we have like these common ways of working agreed. So I'm just gonna stop there. Do we have any questions? Does anyone here have any questions? I saw Todd, you put your hand up first, and then I'll go to Jeremy behind you.
No, I was just going to, can you just recap that first question you asked yourself?
Yeah, sure. So the first question is, can we set good OKRs? So do we have a consistent definition, which is really the starting point for anything, right? And to be honest, hardly anybody spends the time talking about the definition. So that's why we've always had those misaligned expectations. Yeah. Oh, sorry, did you want to go to it?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, at the company level, is there like an optimum number of OKRs? Like you talk about hyper-focus, like I think even the biggest companies could maybe have 3 or 5, or is there, I don't know what your experience is with that.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a couple of organizations that actually have set one objective and then like 3 to 5 key results. I think it's really hard to do, but I think the process of trying to do that is an incredibly valuable one because it means that it cuts out all the noise. So one of my clients, they have 200,000 employees. It was one of the case studies I was going to show, but so they have over 20 products. They have a consumer app with over 20 services on there, delivery services, etc., etc. And they were able to set 2 company objectives. So like one was around growth, that was the theme. And then the key results kind of referred to markets. So then you could see how the different product teams could see which markets they wanted to kind of focus on, because you can't focus on all of them. So you just pick whatever's going to focus within your capacity as a team. Then there was a second objective, which made sense to me, which was really around employee well-being. So it was all the stuff around psychological safety, people following the values, attrition, that sort of thing. So that second objective and the key results, they're kind of focused largely on line managers, but not entirely. You know, so it was also like an opportunity to talk about how are retros being run? Do people need training on retros? Because actually there isn't a lot of safety in retros. So I think if you had to go to 2, then I could kind of see it where one is internally focused and the other one is externally focused on the customers. But if you have more than one objective and they're focused on the external world, that becomes very, very difficult for teams. Sorry, Kate, and then, yeah?
Projections, right?
Oh, lovely, thank you. Oh, you swapped it over, thank you. I'm not sure I can show you anything now, but so, that's no, it's all right. Yeah. So the question is, like, a lot of organizations talk about goals, and are goals the same as OKRs, or are they different? So I think goals don't imply experimentation. You can set goals and then say, great, these are the initiatives or the projects that are going to help us achieve those goals. OKRs imply experimentation. So that for me is the key difference. I mean, oftentimes people use that interchangeably, but I think that's the problem actually. And that's why OKRs are painful, because people treat them just as goals. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that with the key results, it's really important to have the conversation, because goals are also measured, right? Like there are success measures for goals, similar to the key results in OKRs. The thing is though, with OKRs, you tend to have people falling in one of two camps. We treat the key result like a target, like we need to achieve that, which is more like a goal. Or we treat the key result as something that's aspirational. If we get to 50 or 60 or 70% of that, we're doing really well. And that is actually the intention with which OKRs were originally created. You know, they're not meant to be targets. They're actually meant to be aspirational pushes. And you hear, you know, Google talk about moonshots. So there's language, there's terminology in the industry around moonshots and roof shots. So moonshots are like the 10x increase that we want to see, right? We've got 5 users right now. We want to see 100,000 users by the end of the year. How are we going to do that? The way you approach that problem is very different. So that's like, you know, a moonshot key result. A roof shot is like, take the next step forward. You know, so we have 10 users right now. Maybe we can get to 50. So it's not very ambitious. And to me, that's like more like a target, which is more in the spirit of goals. Does that answer the question? Okay. And then I think we have one here. Oh, okay, already answered. Yep.
Thank you, first of all. You mentioned about the OKRs are understood at the top level and then the team level. And you mentioned there's that problem of middle management. How have you explored or tackled those things?
With middle management, in terms of helping them understand
and buy into and not use that as a performance metric or reward metric.
Right. So the performance one is an interesting one, because as soon as you have the conversation about like trying to understand what are middle management trying to achieve, they're trying to achieve ambitious movement as well, right? Like they're not just trying to achieve, they're not trying to see their teams just tick a box. They actually want their teams to be able to push the envelope, right? So when you so when I'm speaking with middle management, the first thing is to figure out, well, are we on the same page? And oftentimes I find that we are. So if that's what they're trying to achieve, then the next thing is to go, great. If we want to achieve that, and we've got this process, and it's tied in with your performance management, well, how are these incentives playing in? And as soon as you kind of highlight the fact that actually we're disincentivizing people from being ambitious, like people get it very quickly. I often find having the conversation with middle management is not the problem when it comes to performance management. The problem actually emerges when you then try to take the conversation to HR. Because HR teams, in my experience, don't always know, well, what's the alternative? Because they only know about using performance as one of the key inputs for individual performance assessment. So there are a couple of, so that's why I think when you have the conversation with HR, it's important to have middle management involved, but then also some examples. So you could say, and online, if you Google it, there are lots of some good examples of organizations who've said, let's not reward individuals based on whether or not, you know, you hit a KR, because that's also not the spirit of KRs. Let's reward people if they're exhibiting company values, right? That's the thing that we want to reward. What are the other things we want to reward? We want to reward moving forward, okay, but people move forward in teams, not as individuals. So do we set a bonus based on teams instead? And then maybe it's a very, very small part, like it's less than 5%, right? So it's nominal, it's notional. But you know, you start to move away then from that kind of individualized performance management. You start thinking about teams. I would prefer actually not even doing it at the team level. You know, have different types of rewards for teams. But yeah, there are lots of examples online around that. But HR is really usually the challenge. Yeah.
Okay, I have one really quick question. Just kind of switch.
Yep, no worries.
Okay, how do you separate or how do you avoid the trap of people trying to achieve the key results and not thinking about whether or not the key result actually contributes to the objective? That disconnection and then below the behavior.
Have you got a specific example? Because we can.
Yeah, I mean, if you say that it's a hypothesis that our objective will be met by achieving this result, but if people try to affect the result directly and don't care about the objective. The Goodhart law trap.
I guess the first step is around trying to figure out, like, why are people doing it? Is it because they're incentivized to? Because, like, you know, that's what managers are also looking at. And so, you know, like, social theory, right? Like we have intrinsic motivators and reasons for why we do things, but there's all the external factors. And in an organization, it's exactly the same. So it's like not only, I believe, trying to find out why are individuals doing it, but why are they encouraged to do it that way and look at it that way? And more often than not, it's because that's how they're being rewarded and punished. So it's about having those open conversations. Yeah, no worries.
Cool. Great. A massive round of applause for Neha.